Hi guys, in today's day I'm going to talk about Apple's most commonly asked 16 interview questions, and I prepared a list here with 16 of them, which I'll present you next with more advice and a couple of examples as well. Now these questions are for all roles, and of course depending on yours you should expect more or less emphasis on certain topics, like for example customer service and sales roles will receive plenty more questions around dealing with customers, okay, whereas managers will receive a ton more questions about how they can add value to their team. Okay, PMs will receive plenty more questions about challenges and dealing with ambiguity in general, whereas developers can expect as well questions around interpersonal skills. Okay, so without further ado, let's just get straight into this list. The first commonly asked question in interviews with Apple is why do you want to join the team, or why you? Okay, so needless to say, it is a good idea that you prepare this in advance, that I don't know, you find a couple of differentiators, your strengths, what could be a compelling value proposition in your case. However, this is nothing more than an introductory questions, and the max you can get out of this is a good first impression and the fact that they will appreciate you prepared it in advance. Okay. Now, what's interesting, what can be interesting about answering such questions is if you don't give obvious answers. Okay, like who doesn't want to join Apple these days, especially they're still hiring. Okay. Here another approach could be if, of course, your CV and your qualifications allow this, would be that, hey, when getting asked why do you want to join Apple, you could simply go along the lines that, hey, you know what, I'm not sure I want to join Apple just as of just yet, because I work in a high performing team, and I'd be really curious at first to learn more how the working environment is here, about my future team, about my future colleagues, and generally speaking about more information about the job. Okay, so if you could pitch it this way, of course, it would be super interesting, but from experience, that's less than 10% of the candidates who can approach the question like this. But here you go. This would be an approach for you to consider. Again, this is an introductory question, very commonly asked, the most commonly asked according to my statistics. The second most commonly asked question at Apple would be, tell me about yourself, your elevator pitch. And here, again, as it's a general type of question, I do recommend, of course, to prepare it because it's super commonly asked, and it will provide you a good first impression. However, if you want to prepare for a job interview for real, in my opinion, it's not the first thing I'd focus on. I'd rather focus on the behavioral question, on my subject matter expertise, on my technical questions if you want for each role. But if I were to talk about, to give you a couple of ideas and examples about what's the best, how can the best elevator pitch look like for your role, I'd say that surprisingly here, ChatGPT can give you some amazing examples on how do you go about answering this for your specific role here. I can tell you that these are the best examples that I was able to use from ChatGPT overall while in job interviews. So I definitely recommend you give it a go if you lack some key ideas, something interesting, if you want, about your elevator pitch. Now, what you should also be beware here, especially for technical roles or engineering roles, the elevator pitch is particularly important because it often serves as a starting point for a conversation. Okay, so if you can talk about your expertise focusing on the highlights, only the highlights, and only your best stories from your career, then chances are the discussion will evolve into your favor in case they want to dive deeper into these things. My idea is here that your elevator pitch should contain all the most compelling, all your key selling points from your professional expertise, in order to give yourself the best chance to drive the conversation the way you want it to go. Okay, you cannot. Okay, unfortunately, you cannot do this all the time, but this is a good reason for you, for engineering and technical roles, to maybe try to keep it simple, focus on clarity of thought, and focus on your strength. Okay, these are the best answers I've ever heard, but again, it's the first impression. And I'm not sure to what extent you believe that first impression is decisive in a job interview with Apple, but in my opinion, there are far more important aspects to prepare for a job interview, as we'll go through them as well next. Number 3 most commonly asked type of question in interviews with Apple is, tell me about the time when you went above and beyond for a customer, or tell me about the time when you worked with a difficult customer, or tell me about the time when you had no idea how to answer a customer request. Okay, but customer-focused questions are the 3rd most commonly asked question in job interviews with Apple, and should give you a good idea on just how important they are in these job interviews. Needless to say that you should really go above and beyond yourself to answer these questions, to try to focus on something peculiar about yourself, like when you really did a difference, when really your intervention made a difference within that interaction with the customer. And here I'm not only talking about specialists or usually people working with customers directly, but also for any type of role, whether customers are internal or external ones. So you should really focus on 1, 2, 3 stories with highlights from your experience of a time when you focused on working with the customer. Importantly here, tell me about the time when you went above and beyond for a customer is a behavioral question. A behavioral question means the interviewer is asking you for your past experiences in order for them to predict your future performance on the job. Okay. What this means is that if this is an interviewing technique, there is also an answering technique for these interview questions, which is very commonly used, and I highly suggest you use the STAR format to answer these questions. Reason why the STAR format is important is both because, if in case you don't know it, it will help you to structure and to better communicate your answers if communication is not your thing, but also importantly, you give them the information in the format that they want to hear. Okay, so this is definitely helpful, especially for them. Now, of course, if you're applying for a director level or executive level role, you could eventually not necessarily fit into a template such as the STAR template: situation, task, action, and results. But I found that 99% of the cases benefit from the STAR answers. And there are various variations, if you want, like combining the situation with the task, or also adding the learnings at the end of your STAR answer. But these are less essential to focus on right now. The main thing is you focus on the STAR answer when answering behavioral questions. Now, going back to a time when you went above and beyond for a customer, like you wouldn't expect this to be a disqualifier, right? Like, who would not treat customers correctly? Who wouldn't care about their customers? Well, in my experience, I've heard various experiences of people who bragged about how they cornered the customer into a deal. So needless to say, cornering a customer into a deal isn't something that should demonstrates how you went above and beyond for a customer, rather how you went above and beyond for a profit. So also importantly here to understand is that many of these companies ask these questions, these customer focus questions, because they strongly believe that not many people, or people who don't have customer focus skills, cannot easily achieve them either. So this is why these questions are super effective. I also give a couple of examples later on in the video about going above and beyond the customers, because there's another type of questions on this topic. Number 4, how do you handle changes or unexpected obstacles during a project? Can you provide examples of a challenging project you successfully completed? Okay, so again, this is how do you handle challenges? How do you deal with ambiguity in general? This is again a behavioral question, so you should use the STAR format: situation, task, action, and result. to answer them. Now, specifically here, how do you handle changes or unexpected obstacles during a project? I would ask you the following question: what's your best story going into the interview? Do you have a best story, one or two, ideally, of these best stories, the ones that you're really sure that you really want them to know about? If you do, then I'm almost certain that that story will contain a challenge, okay, an obstacle. Okay, so if you go backwards, if you try to give the best stories, it's inevitable that your best stories will contain some sort of challenge, some sort of tension, which means that it might be a good candidate. And in my experience, most of the time, this is a great candidate to answer this question. Okay, so how do you handle changes or unexpected obstacles? You answer it with your best story, right? Now, this approach of using your best story to basically fit into as many behaviors as possible does work with on the condition that you do not repeat your stories over and over again, simply because you'll be interpreted as someone who lacks experience or lacks sufficient experience. Okay, if you only have two stories, you spin them with all interviewers, it's obvious that something is not right with you. Okay, so you should be careful about this, but generally, all great stories contain some sort of challenge and therefore would fit into this behavior. Okay, so you listen exactly what do they want to hear from you. Why do they ask you the question about the time when you dealt with a challenge? So they hear, hey, what's this guy good at? What's the level here? Okay, and if you give them your best story, that would be an amazing example. Okay, question number 5: what's your favorite Apple product and why? Okay, so usually when I go through lists of most commonly asked questions at these companies, it's the first 2 or 3 questions are the general one, the elevator pitch, the why do you want to work for this company, and then it's a full list of behavioral questions. Tell me about the time when. Here it's a bit different because the 5th most commonly asked question is what's your favorite Apple product, which is not necessarily a behavioral question, but rather a question to understand, for them to understand, hey, how well do you know Apple's product? And also here, if you don't prepare something in advance, your answer might sound clumsy. For example, in my case, my favorite Apple product would be my MacBook, as I use it most often, and not just for media consumption, but also for productivity tasks. For example, I wrote a script in Pages for this video. Or another example, the first Apple device I had was an iPad, which quickly replaced my laptop at the time for all media consumption activities. Okay, but if I pitch it as a media consumption device, I'm not sure I'd use this if I'd be applying for a technical role, because it's not as strong, because the way I define my favorite product would be my favorite media consumption product, and that's not best for a technical role. Okay, so in my opinion, you should really give it a good thought. What's your favorite Apple product or products, and why? The why is, I believe, the key ingredient of the best answers here. But nevertheless, I don't believe this is super challenging question to answer, so long you prepare it in advance. And number 6, how do you handle feedback or criticism? And can you describe a time when you received constructive feedback and how you acted on it? Okay, so how do you handle feedback or criticism? First and foremost, this is a behavioral question. Tell me about the time when you successfully handled feedback or criticism, right? For example, tell me about the time you received feedback from your manager. How did you respond? Okay, and of course, your answer should be in the star format. But the difference here is the difference between good or so-so and great answers is that most people have a tendency to answer these questions of a time when you receive feedback, of a time when you were wrong and someone else was right. Okay, so for example, when you receive feedback from your manager, well, your manager was right and you were wrong, and say, yes, you were right, and we lived happily ever after. These are not the best answers from my experience, and I'm actually pretty experienced with these things. The best answers that I would pitch in the context of this question was for a time when I exhibited backbone. Okay, when I receive feedback, when someone thought something I had was not right, and I exhibit backbone by showing them, hey, you're not right about this decision that you made, and I gave the data to prove that my decision was the right one. Also, maybe I asked for someone else to intervene and to mediate the discussion and to see all the angles of the discussion. But you don't necessarily have to be wrong and for the other guy to be right to talk about the time when you received feedback here. Okay, so interpersonal skills could also be exhibited through a backbone, by showing backbone here. Okay, but the question is important, and of course also how you reacted is even more important in my opinion. And again, companies these days are not necessarily looking for yes people. They are looking for people who can exhibit backbone, who can really who can really take ownership of their decisions and basically do stuff, get stuff done on their own, even when it's slightly uncomfortable or maybe a little bit cumbersome. Okay, so find something interesting here for such an example. Numbers. So this question of how do you handle feedback is commonly asked for all roles. Okay, because it could talk about your interpersonal skills and about how do you go about these situations. Number 7, how do you add value to the team? Okay, so if you remember in the beginning of the video, I said that managers will receive plenty more questions about working in teams and adding value to their team, because that's one of their should be one of their core competencies. So, for examples here, you could say one time when sales were slow, morale was low for my team, so I reminded them the values and the business proposition in our case, and together with the plan B. Just in case things weren't going to work out as expected. This way I regained their trust and prevented a major event this way. This is the classic structure that you would give to your star answer, because this is again a behavior question. So how can you add value to the team is actually tell me about the time when you added value to the team. Okay, or if you want to go one step further, tell me about 1 or 2 or 3 experiences when you added value to your team. Okay, and if you want to go one step further in quality to providing to such questions, you could talk about 2 positive experiences and 1 negative experience from which you learned something. Okay, when you failed something with a team member, you lost their trust, and then eventually you learned, hey, I'll never do this again. All right, so in behavioral interviews, you don't talk only about positive experience, but also about negative ones. But this is for manager and executive roles, people who have communication as their main skill. Okay, even for salespeople if you want, because salespeople are also supposed to speak well most of the time. So again, when getting asked the question, a time when you added value to the team, you could talk about with a success, and 95% of people would do this, and 5% of people could also talk about a failure, a shortcoming, which they used to their advantage because they had a great learning from this experience. Similarly, how do you handle feedback or criticism, which we went through previously? You could eventually talk about when you handle feedback unsuccessfully, okay? And the learnings, if the learnings are sufficiently interesting to justify such an answer, would definitely make sense. Now, of course, if you fail to handle feedback, and got and made redundant from a previous job, needless to say, it's a bit dangerous to talk about such experience. I mean, it wouldn't play to your strength, to your advantage. Sorry, but the theory is this: you could also use a negative, a failure, if you want, to highlight your strength. And speaking of strengths, the number 8, tell me three strengths and 3 weaknesses that you have, or of course various other flavors. What's your strength? What's that one thing that separates you from others? Or what weakness do you have? Do you have any weakness? Okay, they could also pitch it at this, because some people say, no, I don't have any weaknesses, I only learn. Okay, which would be a terrible answer, by the way. Public speaking, it's not the best. It's not something I recommend, but still works. So I don't hear people getting disqualified from job interviews for using public speaking as their strength. And even for attending Toastmasters to improve their public speaking skills, you should just know that everyone does that. And if everyone does that, I'm not sure that's the main that's the idea you want to transmit for a job interview, where you're supposed to differentiate from other candidates. So if you brainstorm a little bit, maybe you'll find something a bit more interesting. Just don't go with cliches. Don't speak in cliches like "I work hard." It's not the best, unless you have a great story to highlight that, hey, yes, I worked harder than everyone else and achieved the most things there. Okay, so in that case would work, but usually speaking, these cliche strengths would not be the best. And the worst weakness I've ever heard from someone was, I don't have interviewing skills. Okay, so I mean, why would you give a weakness that's completely unrelated with your subject matter expertise? Okay, because I assume he wasn't going for an interview because he wants to interview all his life. Okay, so these were the strengths and weaknesses here. And number 9, tell me about the time when you went above and beyond. Okay, and why would someone ask you such a question in a job interview, time when you went above and beyond? Well, they want to get a better idea on how you interpret quality in general. Okay, and in the beginning of the video, I said that I believe the third most commonly asked question in a job interview with Apple is around customer. Okay, so in interaction with customers and how do you interact, how do you help customers? And I thought that I've heard people of bragging about how they cornered the customer into a deal within a customer obsession environment. Okay, so here maybe a time when you went above and beyond. An example or a differentiate, to give you a couple of examples to give you a better idea of here what I mean by this, is that some developers, for instance, have a tendency to call a bug fix, which they fixed on priority, as a time when they went above and beyond for a customer. Okay, which, in my opinion, that can be. You can have much better examples than this, such as when you took ownership and did an extra feature or some optimization because you thought was cool for a customer. Okay, so you went from strength to strength, not from weakness, because when you have a bug, of course you must fix it. If you fix it on priority, it doesn't mean you show customer obsession. Okay, it's just a bug after all. So try to find something when you literally went above and beyond to do something that 99% of the people wouldn't do for a customer. And if the better you think about it, the more likely you'll find something really interesting. And I would say it again, customer focus is hard. Not everyone has this, and these companies are fairly convinced, or at least Amazon is convinced, that you cannot train for customers. So you cannot have people to become customer obsessed unless they have that something, So to a certain extent, I do agree with them that there are people who are not best in customer service, but in high quality roles. They simply cannot focus. These are not their standards. So be sure to brainstorm as much as possible for examples of literally a time when you went above and beyond to provide high quality. Okay, and try to ensure that high quality is something truly high quality, because it's really important, and this is where they get a better feeling, again, as I said in the beginning, of how someone interprets quality in general. Okay, number 10 here. What's your greatest professional accomplishment? Okay, so yes, this question does indeed get asked, and I actually call this question as gifts. Okay, so if someone asks you this in a job interview, I call this a gift. The reason for this is because this is the best opportunity for you to sell yourself on your best story, which, believe it or not, if I'd have to ask many of you while starting your preparation for an interview, or even a few days before the interview, unfortunately, you wouldn't have a best story to sell yourself on. So I guess the best learning from this question, what's your greatest professional accomplishment, would be to really brainstorm for stories and for your best stories in particular. But again, this is a gift question. It does happen. It's the 10th most commonly asked question, sign that they really do want to help you to get hired there. But again, you must prepare such stories in advance, and to really understand that it's actually a gift, not to be suspicious that, hey, the one it's a trap or something like this. Number 11, where do you see yourself 5 years from now? Okay, so this is a question that's usually asked by HR people. So of course it's worth prepping in advance, and many times, where do you see yourself 5 years from now, it's something that I would blend inside my either my elevator pitch or when talking about why I'd like to join the team. Okay, actually a template for answering why do you want to join the team would be, first you focus on companies. Hey, Apple has a great culture, cultural attributes or values if you want. And the second is how can I add value to the team? Okay, so what's your unique value proposition? So you'd focus on these two key elements while answering your elevator pitch. And while answering your key value proposition, then you'd also focus on where you see what's in for you as well. Where do you see yourself 5 years from now? Okay, but usually where do you see yourself 5 years from now is music to HR's ears, and that's why I believe it's also an interesting, interestingly enough, reason for you to take it seriously. Number 12, tell me about the time when you learned something new. Okay, so seemingly a super easy question. However, this can be challenging to answer in the context of an intense job interview if you haven't prepared something in advance. For example, do you have something interesting to talk about that you learned recently, which would basically make sense to sell yourself on your expertise? It's not always that people can come up with examples on the spot, with their best examples on the spot. And of course, the best learners do learn stuff from multiple sources. Okay, so you could also pitch it this way. Okay, so number 13 here, what's your biggest failure? Okay, so these are the failure questions. If you remember earlier in the video, I talked about how you can sell yourself on your strength also through failures, even if you're not asked for one. If communication is your skill and your failure is a highlight in your career, it's a big learning point in your career. Now, at Apple, according to my statistics, it's only the 13th most commonly asked question, whereas in other companies, they ask it far more often than this. But still, what's interesting about failure stories, about answering these failure stories, first, it's a behavior question, so you answer it in a star format. Also interesting here is that in the star format, in the action part of your answer is the actual failure, okay, quantifiable if you can with some impact to highlight a little bit also an effect. But the important thing is here, the result should be the learnings. And the results, why do I say the results and not the learnings, should talk about the learnings, is because it's this important, that in a failure story, what you're selling yourself on is the learnings, okay? And I recommend that you go as far as to have half of your answer in the learnings, okay, in the case of a failure story. For example, for manager and executive level roles, I would recommend 2 or 3 of these failure stories. And if you're just getting started, my bid is that it will take you at least 3 attempts to find the proper failure story that you'd be actually happy talking about in a job interview. Many people shy away from talking about negative experience in job interviews because they simply couldn't get over those negative experience, or let me put it another way, they don't know what they learned from this, which if you ask me, is not a good sign, because if you don't learn from these or if you don't have any key learnings from these, it means either you cannot get over them, they are too fresh, in which case maybe don't use them because they might damage you, or you're simply not willing to accept, like the type of person who asks, do you have any failures? No, sir, I don't have any failures, I only learn. Okay, so these types of people. And of course, if you don't have any failures but you only learn, it means, in my opinion, you are either a fresher, either someone who is not the best person for any job at this point. All right, number 14, what are you into besides work? Okay, what are your hobbies? Okay, so here you could talk about family, sports, charities, you name it. Probably also interesting to note here that for certain roles, it wouldn't be a bad idea if you blended your extracurricular activities into work-related ones as well. For example, for sales roles, okay, being involved in charities, needless to say, that can also bring some advantages in general. But if you show a bit of commercialism, it's not a problem. In my experience, actually quite recommended if you can, for the roles that it makes the most sense here. Okay, but again, as with the failure stories, your extracurricular activities are only on the 14th spot of the 16 in my statistics, so it's not as often that they ask you this. So again, you could, if you remember at the where do you see yourself in the 5 years from now, you could also blend this inside your elevator pitch. So what are you into besides work? Okay, because it could be something, an interesting addition. Maybe you didn't, maybe you want to highlight something from your CV because your CV usually contains these extracurricular activities, but usually these bits of information can be, packaged in your tell me about yourself. So not a commonly asked question, but definitely a chance to pitch yourself as the best candidate, especially for sales roles, in my opinion. Number 15, can you give me an example of a time when you had to do a gut-wrenching prioritization? So, not a very commonly asked question, but coaching and training for behavior interviews, I can tell you that prioritizations do sell well, especially for more technical roles, for PM roles if you want, even if they're not technical. But these types of answers allow you to sell yourself on your on your subject matter expertise. Okay, because in project management there are various prioritization techniques. Okay, but also in sales, if you want, also in customer service, you put the customer first, of course, but it's not as easy. I'm sure there are some frameworks as well in that context, but a time when you did a gut-wrenching prioritization is a subsection of the questions which I talked about in the beginning. The number 4 most commonly asked question: how do you handle challenges or unexpected obstacles during a project? Okay, so gut-wrenching prioritization perfectly can blend into that type of question. And the best answers I've heard and the best answers I have all use frameworks to prioritize certain aspects, because what happens is when you use frameworks, you also have more credibility. Okay, so even if you use gut feeling, and I strongly do mention that you use gut feeling in important decisions, having that extra layer of trust, of credibility coming from a framework is something that I find highly beneficial. And some people go as far as to buy a whiteboard for their interview just to highlight the concept of prioritization. Okay, but this would be more for the technical roles. For the PM roles, also developers might use these presentation techniques for the technical parts of their interview, if that makes sense for your role as well. But needless to say, a gut-wrenching, a time when you prioritize something is a question that I highly recommend preparing for an upcoming interview, because it does get asked as well. And number 16, to conclude here, what do you know about Apple's mission and values? Do you know them? If you want, I have a video where I made a compilation of Tim Cook's best appearances with respect to this. they're not as common. They don't put that much emphasis as other companies do with respect when it comes to the job interviews. But still, a points you can easily score if you read these in advance, and I believe it's also a few minutes of work here. So there you go. It all boils down to producing, in my opinion, these interviews all boil down to producing a competitive story bank, which is nothing more than a list with the best highlights in your career, focusing on these key behaviors. Try to add a couple of failures here and there, but the main takeaway is that the people with the best stories in these interviews also are the ones who pass them. And unfortunately, from my experience, it's only 5% of the candidates, or less than 5% of the candidates, who actually have a story bank that they can say it's a story bank going into a job interview. So I'm not sure if it's unfortunate, but maybe fortunately in your case, because you could differentiate yourself this way. But my advice as a coach and from selling actually training programs would be to focus on preparing a story bank which could answer, this list of questions. I'm also going to add this below the video. But this is the main thing. If you prepare for the interview, prepare on what matters the most here. And you could go as far as to prepare for 6 months to have a strong story bank. This happens. There are people who prepare for 1 year to pass these interviews, because it can be a life-changing event for the better, of course. So this is why I take it seriously. So there you go. I hope you found this information useful, and thank you very much for watching.